My name is Allie, and I'm in Swallow's Home House Church, shepherded by Roger and Shinji Pack. When I signed up for Word Life, I had no idea that sharing testimonies was part of the course schedule. And given the relatively large class size, I'm not going to lie, I was somewhat disappointed at first. We would have to waste 4 classes to fit in that many testimonies. 4 classes that I felt could be better spent learning and digging deeper into content. But looking back, I'm grateful for those 4 weeks of sharing because they brought God's word to life in a way that more content and head knowledge couldn't have done. So I've heard that the Bible can be thought of as big story, little story. Sometimes the big story of the Bible is easy to lose sight of because it's told through many little stories, which are sometimes violent, confusing, or just plain weird. So what's the big story? In the first class, the Bible was summarized like this. The whole Bible can be portrayed as a very long answer to a very simple question. What can God do about the sin and rebellion of the human race? So the Bible is a story about what God is going to do about the sin and rebellion of the human race, and this big story is told through little stories about sinful, rebellious people. So sin entered the story early on in Genesis 3. Adam and Eve were essentially given a choice between life and defining for themselves what was good. And I'm sure you didn't have to take the class to know what choice they made. They ate the fruit, declaring they knew better than God. And much of the Old Testament illustrates why something even needed to be done about the sin and rebellion of the human race. Genesis 3 gets repeated over and over again, with people trading life for death, swayed and tempted by the same lie. You will not surely die, you will be like God. Long story short, when you have all these little wannabe gods running around defining what's good from their singular selfish perspective, evil and brokenness prevail. 4 little stories that we learned about were Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. 3 of them were Gentiles, 2 Canaanites, and 1 Moabite, and these were enemy nations with whom Israel was often at war and warned against intermarrying. One of them was a prostitute, and one of them pretended to be a prostitute so that her father-in-law would have a child with her. One of them was at the center of a great scandal, which included adultery, murder, abuse of power, political upheaval. These are also the only 4 women, in addition to Mary herself, who are listed in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. So Bathsheba isn't even identified by name, only that she, quote, had been Uriah's wife, which immediately reminds you of that whole messy affair. Discovering these 4 names in the genealogy and connecting them with their backstory illustrated how these little stories, which might seem random, supported the bigger story of what God was doing. They were directly linked to the answer to the question, which is Jesus. It's also quite amazing that our holy and righteous God, in recording the lineage of Christ, chose not to scrub away every hint of scandal and make Jesus' bloodline look as pure and unblemished as possible, but he kept this record as a reminder that what man intends for evil, God uses for good. And he doesn't just invite perfect, impressive people into his family, but embraces people like Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. As we transitioned in the class from lectures to testimonies, I was reminded that the story of what God is doing didn't end with the Bible. And the great cosmic story of what he's doing today is still comprised of our little stories. The Bible reveals what God did about the sin of the whole human race, and my testimony revealed what God has done about the sin and rebellion of Allie. And not just my testimony, but the testimony of each of my classmates. No matter how early on in our lives we met God, people, myself included, often described a period of wandering, of doing what was right in our own eyes, of repeatedly making that Genesis 3 choice, of defining good and evil for ourselves and finding ourselves caught in a web of our own making from which we couldn't escape, until Jesus. Jesus is the Bible's answer to the sin and rebellion of the human race, just as Jesus is the answer to my sin and rebellion. Many of my classmates shared painful and sometimes shocking histories, and I was shocked not because of what people had done or endured, but because it was so different from how I see them now. While we may be at various stages in healing, the transformation already on display in their lives was further evidence that Jesus is God's answer to sin and rebellion. In all honesty, I think I entered the class more intent on acquiring head knowledge, and because of this, I was quick to dismiss the testimony portion. But I was wrong to do this because the Bible is a book, and it's an amazing one, but like any book, it must end. However, God's story hasn't ended yet. And while Word Life would have been amazing and interesting without all of the testimonies, I think I might have missed out on the continuation of God's ongoing story. The Bible was told by different authors in multiple languages over the course of many centuries, yet somehow it miraculously holds together without contradiction. And I saw this same validity and spiritual unity in the testimonies of my classmates as well. Despite differences in age, race, class, and life experience, we shared learning similar truths and came to the same conclusion that in him was life. Without the word, we have no testimony, but without the testimony, we risk missing the whole purpose, the end to which God was working from Genesis 3 to Jesus and until now, and that purpose is to restore us to life. So thank you to all of my classmates for sharing so transparently and demonstrating the power of Jesus in your lives. And thank you, Lynette, for teaching us about the big and the little stories of the Bible and for giving us a platform to share our own.